May 23rd, 1706. A gentle slope in the Spanish Netherlands. The Duke of Marlborough sat on his horse, watching 60,000 French soldiers deploy across a 4-mile front. They held every advantage: high ground, fortified villages, a marsh protecting their flank. Marshal Villeroi, commanding the French, believed his position was unassailable. He was confident. His officers were confident. King Louis XIV had given him one order: stop Marlborough. Destroy the English general who'd humiliated France at Blenheim 2 years earlier. What happened in the next 4 hours would be called Marlborough's masterpiece, the most brilliant tactical victory of the age, a battle where 62,000 men faced 62,000 men on equal terms, and one side was utterly annihilated, where Marlborough himself nearly died leading a cavalry charge. This is the story of Ramillies. The battle that proved Blenheim was no fluke. The day when John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, demonstrated why he was the greatest general of his age, and the afternoon when France learned that their armies, their tactics, and their generals simply couldn't match the English commander who'd already changed European warfare forever. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into Marlborough's tactical masterpiece, a battle where brilliant deception, perfectly timed cavalry charges, and audacious personal courage combined to produce one of the most one-sided victories in military history. Because Ramillies wasn't about numbers or firepower, it was about a general who understood warfare better than anyone alive, and had the courage to risk everything, including his own life, to prove it. But before we get to that decisive cavalry charge, before we watch the French army disintegrate in 4 hours of fighting, we need to understand how Marlborough reached this point. Because without knowing what Blenheim had meant, and why France was desperate to stop him, you can't appreciate what happened when these two massive armies finally collided on that Flemish plain. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Ramillies. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1704, when Marlborough had marched 250 miles across Europe to save Vienna and destroyed a Franco-Bavarian army at Blenheim. That victory had shocked France. For decades, French armies had dominated Europe. French tactics, French generals, French military might seemed invincible. Louis XIV's war machine had crushed the Spanish, humbled the Dutch, and threatened the Habsburgs. French culture dominated European courts. French language was spoken by educated elites everywhere. French military supremacy seemed as permanent as the sun rising in the east. Then an English general had annihilated 60,000 French and Bavarian troops in one afternoon. King Louis XIV never fully recovered from the humiliation. The Sun King, who'd spent his entire reign projecting invincibility, had to explain to his court how an English commoner, for Marlborough, despite his titles, came from relatively modest origins, had destroyed France's finest army. French officers, who'd been captured at Blenheim, returned home with stories of English discipline, Allied coordination, and Marlborough's tactical genius. The stories spread. French confidence wavered. But Louis wasn't finished. He was 68 years old in 1706, nearing the end of his reign, and determined to restore French glory before he died. He rebuilt his armies, appointed new commanders, studied Blenheim's lessons, and prepared to crush the rebellion in the Spanish Netherlands. The coalition of English, Dutch, and German states that opposed French hegemony. By spring 1706, France had assembled multiple armies across the Low Countries. Marshal Villeroi commanded the main French force in Flanders. His orders were clear: find Marlborough and destroy him. Avenge Blenheim. Prove that France could still win. Show Europe that Blenheim was an aberration, not the new normal. Villeroi was 53 years old, an experienced general who'd fought in Louis XIV's wars for decades. He was competent, cautious, and politically well-connected, essential traits for survival in Louis's court. He understood that defeating Marlborough would restore his king's prestige and his own reputation. He also understood that losing would end his career. Everything rode on this campaign. Marlborough, for his part, had spent the winter preparing. He commanded a coalition army, English redcoats, Dutch infantry, Danish cavalry, German mercenaries, all supposedly under his command, but in reality requiring endless diplomacy to keep unified. The Dutch were cautious, terrified of casualties, prone to vetoing aggressive plans. They remembered the disasters of earlier wars, when Dutch armies had been destroyed by French forces. They wanted Marlborough to win, but not at the cost of Dutch blood. The Germans wanted glory, but were unreliable, often demanding impossible terms before committing troops. The Danes fought brilliantly, but demanded constant payment, threatening to go home if their subsidies were late. Managing this coalition was as difficult as fighting the French, perhaps more difficult. But Marlborough was a master politician as well as a general. He flattered, cajoled, bribed, and occasionally ignored his allies when necessary. He wrote endless letters to Dutch politicians, assuring them their concerns were his priority. He negotiated with German princes, promising them glory and plunder. He ensured Danish paymasters received their gold on time. By spring 1706, he'd assembled an army of approximately 62,000 men, roughly equal to Villeroi's French force. Equal numbers meant equal chances, or so everyone thought. In early May, Marlborough began manoeuvring, seeking battle on favourable terms. Villeroi shadowed him, trying to force the English general into a trap, or at minimum prevent him from besieging French-held fortresses. For 2 weeks, the armies marched and countermarched across the Spanish Netherlands, neither willing to fight on disadvantageous ground. Contemporary observers thought both commanders were being too cautious, that another indecisive campaign season loomed. More marching, more skirmishing, but no decisive battle. Newspapers in London complained that Marlborough was wasting time. Dutch politicians questioned whether their subsidies were achieving anything. The politicians wanted battles. The soldiers wanted rest. Nobody was satisfied. They were wrong. Marlborough was waiting for the perfect moment. He was manoeuvring Villeroi into a position where the French would have to fight or abandon key fortresses. And on May 23, 1706, near the village of Ramillies, that moment arrived. The French deployed first, taking position on a low ridge running roughly north-south. It was textbook defensive terrain. Their right flank anchored on the villages of Autre-Église and Ramillies, which they'd fortified with earthworks and barricades. Their centre extended north through open ground, gently rolling farmland, perfect for cavalry. Their left flank held the villages of Offuz and Anderkirk, with marshy ground beyond the Petite Guite stream. Villeroi had approximately 62,000 men, mostly French infantry and cavalry, with some Spanish and Bavarian contingents still loyal to Louis XIV's candidate for the Spanish throne. His artillery was positioned to cover the approaches. His cavalry was strong. French horsemen were considered among Europe's finest. His infantry confident. French regulars had won dozens of battles. Everything suggested a tough defensive battle that might last days, possibly ending in bloody stalemate. Marlborough studied the French position from a church tower in the village of Merdorp. Most generals would have seen an impregnable line, fortified villages, good fields of fire, cavalry positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. Marlborough saw a weakness. The French had deployed relatively evenly along their entire 4-mile front. That meant they weren't concentrated anywhere. If he could fix the French right with a feint attack, then smash their centre with overwhelming force, he could break their line. The villages looked strong, but villages could be bypassed. The marsh on the French left looked like an obstacle, but Marlborough's scouts had already reported it was passable, wet and difficult, but not impossible. And the French cavalry in the centre, that was where the battle would be decided. Cavalry against cavalry in open ground, the classic decisive engagement. Around 1 p.m., Marlborough ordered his army forward. The initial attack hit the French right at Ramillies village. Dutch and English infantry advanced in organized lines, colours flying, drums beating the pace. French defenders opened fire from houses and hastily built barricades. Musket balls tore through attacking ranks. Men fell screaming. Officers shouted orders. The assault was fierce, costly, and seemingly the main effort, the kind of frontal attack on fortified positions that characterized so much of European warfare. Villeroi, watching from his command position, concluded that Marlborough was trying to turn his right flank by capturing Ramillies and rolling up the French line from south to north. He began shifting reserves toward Ramillies, weakening his centre to reinforce the villages. French infantry battalions marched south. Cavalry squadrons repositioned to support the right. Villeroi was doing exactly what competent commanders do, reinforcing the threatened sector, exactly as Marlborough had planned. On the French left, Marlborough launched a simultaneous attack against Offuz and Anderkirk. Danish cavalry splashed through the marsh, which turned out to be less impassable than it looked, and engaged French cavalry protecting the villages. The Danes fought with their characteristic ferocity, sabering French horsemen who'd assumed the marsh protected them. Again, this looked like a serious effort, not a feint, but a genuine attempt to break the French left. Villeroi shifted more reserves left, further thinning his centre. French battalions that had been positioned in the centre marched to the flanks, leaving gaps. But these attacks on both flanks were feints, brilliantly executed, costly enough to be convincing, but fundamentally diversions, holding attacks designed to fix French forces in place while Marlborough prepared his killing blow. And that blow was aimed at the French centre, where cavalry would fight cavalry in open ground with no villages or marshes to interfere. Classical cavalry warfare, shock, melee, the decisive breakthrough. Marlborough had secretly concentrated his best cavalry squadrons in the center: British, Dutch, Danish, German horsemen, perhaps 20,000 cavalry total. They waited in formation, mostly hidden from French view by gentle terrain folds and the smoke from the flank attacks. When Villeroi finally realized what was happening, that the flank attacks were diversions and the real assault was coming in the center, where he'd weakened his line, it was too late. He tried to recall his reserves, but they were committed to the flanks and couldn't disengage quickly without abandoning the villages. French units started marching back toward the center, but Marlborough's timing was perfect. The cavalry charge began before French reinforcements could arrive. Around 3 p.m., Marlborough ordered the cavalry charge. 20,000 horsemen surged forward against the French cavalry center. The impact was tremendous. 2 walls of armored men on horseback colliding at full gallop, sabers drawn, pistols firing at point-blank range, horses screaming as they crashed into each other. The noise must have been deafening. Thousands of sabers clashing, pistols firing, men shouting, horses dying. The 2 cavalry forces locked together in brutal melee. This wasn't the organized warfare of infantry lines firing volleys. This was chaos, violence, individual combats multiplied across hundreds of yards of churned-up farmland. For a crucial few minutes, the outcome was uncertain. French cavalry were experienced, well-trained, fighting for their king's honor. They held their ground, trading blows, neither side gaining clear advantage. Squadrons swirled together, broke apart, reformed, charged again. Officers tried to maintain some organization, but cavalry melees were inherently chaotic. This was traditional cavalry combat, courage and skill in close quarters, neither side able to break the other through sheer force. The French were holding. If they could maintain their position long enough, reinforcements from the flanks would arrive and turn the tide. Then Marlborough did something that generals weren't supposed to do. He personally led a cavalry charge into the melee. At 56 years old, Marlborough should have been commanding from a safe distance, watching the battle unfold from a hill, sending orders to subordinates via aides-de-camp. That's what generals did. They were too valuable to risk in combat. Their death or capture would collapse entire armies. But Marlborough saw his cavalry wavering, saw the French holding firm, and made an instant decision. He spurred his horse forward, drew his sword, and charged into the thick of the fighting. His staff officers, horrified and inspired in equal measure, followed him. They couldn't let their general ride into battle alone. The Duke of Marlborough, supreme commander of Allied forces, the man whose death would collapse the entire coalition, was now fighting hand-to-hand in a cavalry melee like a common trooper. His example electrified the Allied cavalry. Squadrons that had been wavering surged forward. Men who'd been ready to fall back saw their general fighting beside them and refused to retreat. How could they abandon the field when their commander was in the thick of the fight? The Allied cavalry began pushing the French back. Not quickly, not easily, but inexorably. The French center started giving ground, but Marlborough's personal heroism nearly cost him his life. In the chaos of the melee, his horse was shot and killed beneath him. The animal collapsed, throwing Marlborough to the ground. He landed hard, stunned, surrounded by enemy cavalry. French horsemen closed in, recognizing the Allied commander by his distinctive uniform and the clustering of staff officers. If they captured or killed Marlborough here, the battle, possibly the entire war, would turn. France would have avenged Blenheim in the most dramatic way possible. His aide-de-camp, Captain Molesworth, saw the danger. He jumped from his own horse, hauled Marlborough to his feet, and held off French cavalry with his sword while the Duke mounted Molesworth's horse. Molesworth fought with desperate courage. 3 French cavalrymen tried to cut him down, slashing at him with sabres, but he parried their blows long enough for Marlborough to escape. Then Molesworth himself was pulled to safety by other Allied cavalry who'd ridden to rescue their general. The entire incident lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds could have changed European history. Marlborough, shaken but unhurt, immediately returned to commanding. He'd been seconds from death or capture. Instead, he'd rallied his cavalry and broken the French centre. The crisis had passed. Now came the exploitation. With the French cavalry centre collapsing, Marlborough ordered his infantry forward. Allied infantry battalions advanced in perfect lines, maintaining formation despite the chaos around them. This was the discipline that made European armies effective: the ability to advance under fire, maintain ranks, obey orders even when men were dying around you. French infantry, seeing their cavalry fleeing and Allied horsemen threatening their flanks, tried to form defensive squares, the standard anti-cavalry formation. But Allied artillery pounded them while cavalry threatened from multiple directions. You can't fight cavalry and artillery simultaneously. French units began withdrawing, then retreating, then running. Officers lost control. Battalions dissolved into fleeing mobs. Villeroi tried desperately to stabilize his line. He rode among fleeing soldiers, shouting orders, threatening, pleading. Rally on the colours, reform, stand and fight. But the collapse was total. When the centre breaks in linear warfare, armies disintegrate. Units lose contact with each other. Officers can't find their men. Messengers can't deliver orders because no one knows where anyone is. Panic spreads like wildfire. What had been an organized army of 62,000 men became a fleeing mob of terrified individuals just trying to survive. The French right at Ramillies village, still fighting stubbornly against Allied attacks, suddenly found themselves isolated. Allied cavalry had broken through the centre and was now behind them, threatening encirclement. The garrisons abandoned Ramillies and fled north. The entire French right wing dissolved. Thousands of French infantry who'd been holding the villages now ran for their lives, throwing away weapons to run faster. On the French left, the same pattern repeated. Danish cavalry, pushing through the marsh, overwhelmed the weakened French left after reserves had been pulled away to reinforce the centre and right. The villages fell within minutes. French units ran north toward Brussels, desperate to escape Allied cavalry that was hunting them like wolves pursuing sheep. The pursuit became a slaughter. Tired, disorganized infantry can't escape fresh cavalry. Allied horsemen cut down hundreds of fleeing French soldiers. By 7 p.m., just 4 hours after the battle began, the French army had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Villeroi's 62,000 men were scattered across miles of Flemish countryside, fleeing in complete disorder. Allied cavalry pursued through the night, cutting down stragglers, capturing artillery, taking thousands of prisoners. Some French units held together long enough to reach Brussels. Others dissolved completely. soldiers deserting and trying to make their way back to France individually. The army that had deployed so confidently that morning was gone. The casualties were catastrophic for France. Approximately 15,000 French soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on the battlefield. Another 10,000 deserted or dispersed during the retreat, never rejoining their units. The French lost all their artillery, 120 guns captured, each one representing months of foundry work and enormous expense. 50 regimental colours were taken, the ultimate humiliation for any army, each colour representing a regiment's honour and history. Entire cavalry regiments were destroyed. The infantry was shattered. Marshal Villeroi escaped, but his reputation was ruined. He'd been given France's finest army and lost it in 4 hours. He'd returned to France in disgrace. Allied casualties were remarkably light, about 3,600 killed and wounded. The decisive cavalry action in the centre had been costly, but compared to French losses, it was minimal. Marlborough had won a victory as complete as Blenheim, but with far fewer Allied casualties. It was a masterpiece of tactical warfare, deception, concentration of force, personal courage, and relentless pursuit combining to produce total enemy destruction. The strategic consequences exceeded even the battlefield victory. With the French army destroyed, the entire Spanish Netherlands lay open. Brussels fell within days. The garrison, hearing of Ramillies, surrendered without fighting. Antwerp surrendered. Ghent opened its gates. Bruges, Ostend, Menin, fortress after fortress, fell to Marlborough's advancing army. Years of French campaigning, thousands of casualties, massive expenditure, all erased in 4 hours at Ramillies. French garrisons across the Netherlands, isolated and demoralized, surrendered rather than face siege. By autumn, France had lost virtually every territory they'd held in the Low Countries. Louis XIV's Netherlands strategy was in ruins. King Louis XIV, receiving news of the disaster at Versailles, was reportedly struck speechless. Courtiers, who'd expected to celebrate victory instead, delivered catastrophic news. Blenheim could be explained away. Unlucky combination of circumstances, bad subordinates, unforeseen complications. But Ramillies, equal numbers, good defensive position, experienced commander who'd been specifically ordered to defeat Marlborough. No excuses. The English general had simply outfought, outmaneuvered, and outthought France's finest. Louis was 68 years old. He'd reigned since 1643, 63 years on the throne. And now, in the twilight of his reign, his military supremacy was crumbling. For Marlborough, Ramillies cemented his reputation as the age's supreme general. He'd already won Blenheim. Now he'd proven it wasn't luck. His tactical system, combined arms coordination, deception, aggressive exploitation, was demonstrably superior to traditional French methods. And his personal courage, leading cavalry charges at 56, risking capture to inspire his men, made him beloved by his soldiers. British cavalry who'd fought at Ramillies told stories of the Duke fighting beside them for the rest of their lives. The British public celebrated wildly. Ramillies, following Blenheim, proved that Britain had found a military genius. London erupted in celebrations. Bells rang from every church. Bonfires blazed. Parliament voted funds for Marlborough's palace, Blenheim Palace, already under construction, would be even grander than planned. Queen Anne awarded him honours and titles. The man who'd started as the son of a minor nobleman was now the most celebrated general in Europe, showered with wealth and honours. If this is the kind of history that makes you proud, brilliant generals, decisive victories, tactical masterpieces that changed Europe, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.